I've often wondered what a neoconservative is. We see it in the newspaper, we hear it, used in vocabulary discussions, and I thought, I'm supposed to be an educated man. I don't even know what they're talking about. You hear it on the news, see whatever the news channels are, and they're using, neoconservative. So I finally decided to find out. This is my brief summary of neoconservatives. Neoconservatives joined the conservatives in the 1970s. Now, in the 1970s, I was a student at Berkeley. And I remember the nature of the institution. Now, this is the University of California at Berkeley. And you remember what they were famous for in the 60s? Any of you with gray hair? The hippies? I was there as a student during that period of time. I was already an adult, had graduate degrees, and was doing further studies. But the conservatives joined the conservatives in the 1970s. 3 points to make. They came from disillusioned liberal intellectuals in the 70s who wanted big government. They had an idealism similar to Trotskyite communism. They wanted international socialist revolution. Now this sounds bizarre, but I believe this is an accurate summary of the neoconservative today. America should be the world's policeman. Why do we have 130 countries with troops in them around the world? Because we're directed and run by neoconservatives. That might be the reason. We think we're supposed to be policing the whole world. They believed in warmongering. Warmongering is the very essence of neoconservatism. We need to have war going on somewhere in the world all the time to be good neoconservatives. And so in my life, I do not believe we've ever had a lull where we didn't have war going on somewhere in the world, caused, directed, promoted, encouraged, supported by the United States of America. Trick question. When was the last time that Congress declared war? Okay, you're getting close, but now tell me the date and who we declared war on. It was World War II. It was not Japan. That was not the last one. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary in 1943 in June. Most people don't know that. Anyway, we've been warmongering for a long time after we declared war. An alien. Oh, we were just talking about this a moment ago, about J. Reuben Clark. First, before we give the quotation, let's look at the definition of an alien. Have you ever heard of illegal aliens? And we're not supposed to use that, some people say. Oh, those are foreigners coming in to the country. An illegal alien is a person who has an allegiance to a foreign country. A resident who bears political allegiance to another country. They came in here for reasons that other than we'll try and describe, but they came in and their allegiance is not to the United States. Now let's use a quotation here. This great American hero, J. Reuben Clark. In October of 1943, he gave this speech. He gave lots of speeches. He was the beloved person who was invited to speak to great dignitaries all around the country. Following years of scheming, plotting, and working, aliens have laid their withering and corrupting hand upon all governmental agencies and activities. That's very interesting. In 1943, he recognized. He was a top leader in the country. He was the Undersecretary of State. He was ambassador to Mexico. He was a renowned world lawyer and scholar. And he knows what he's talking about. Aliens have laid their withering and corrupting hand upon all governmental agencies and activities. We'll learn in a later lesson, in a little more detail, about the Venona Secrets, which is a book explaining the Venona Papers, which were made available in 1995 when Mikhail Gorbachev opened the files in the Soviet Union in his program of Glasnost and Perestroika, and he allowed people to see what the Soviet Union files held with regard to who were the spies in America, who were the communists in America during the Roosevelt administration. Do you remember a man named Joseph McCarthy? Hero or villain? Hero. Most people think he's a villain because of the official literature that has been passed around since he was treated so abusively by the Senate. The Monona Papers point out 329 communist spies in the Roosevelt administration. And so in 1943, this man doesn't probably know their names, but he knows that something is bad, something evil is happening. Aliens have laid their withering and corrupting hand upon all governmental agencies and activities. And they were at the highest levels of government where they had laid their withering hand. One of them lived in the White House. An alien, a communist living in the White House? Yes, he lived in the White House with his wife. Who would that be? Which communist supporter lived in the White House with Franklin Delano Roosevelt? That was a good answer. But that wasn't the one I'm referring to. Harry Hopkins. Yeah, but Colonel House was a little earlier. He was with Woodrow Wilson. Anyway, this is history that we don't know about. And so some Americans still say how bad Senator Joseph McCarthy was. Well, I say, yes, Senator Joseph McCarthy was wrong. He was telling us there was a communist under every bush, and he was wrong. There were really two when we get the rest of the story. Back to our political spectrum, that's what it is here. All of the political thinking or all of the governmental agencies can be placed along this line. Heaven on earth compared to hell on earth. We would have a constitutional republic of republics as established by our Heavenly Father through those great men that He raised up, if we wanted to have the closest to heaven on earth. Evolutionary socialists, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, these would be the ones that would be promoting governments in between. Now, evolutionary socialism is different than revolutionary socialism, and I believe that's how we end this lesson today. Revolutionary socialists were ones who would use force to bring their plan of government to the people around them, as would the Unionists, the Nazis, the Fascists, and the Communists. These are all words pertaining to groups in the past who used force to impose their will upon the people. Books are a good way to learn. In fact, they're the best way. I love to read books that are well written by good scholars. I found this one interesting. Red Republicans, Marxism and the Civil War. Why did Karl Marx and other socialists find the Unionist war worthy of their support? Why did these radical socialists feel a kinship with the Northern Union and share the desire for the destruction of the South? Delightful reading if you're trying to learn about that period of time, printed in 2007. Constitutional Republic of Republics, governed by scientific law versus absolute tyranny. Socialism, governed by political law or representative democracy. Now, there's been a lot of talk in recent months in this area about, are we a democracy or a republic? And finally, we get no conclusions I've heard of, but we give our lesson last night in detail on that. How many were there last night? Goodly number of you. And I tried to answer that question, the difference between representative democracy and a republic. They just make it up in a representative democracy. Newsweek, we are all socialists now. Well, I don't think you're socialist. You wouldn't come here if you were. I don't know. I would like to have a few socialists attend. Are any socialists here that would admit it? No raise of hands. I think that we probably have put socialism down to where you would keep quiet if you were. Oh, we won't do that. We just had our break. I always forget I have a break rest slide in here, but the rest slide we passed. Oops, that was the ringing of the Liberty Bell. Now we go on. Alexander Hamilton. We have all these founding fathers. We call them that some great generic, well, the founding fathers said. You heard things like that. Well, did they really all say that? They all stood in a choir and they said it together in unison? Hardly. So when we say the founding fathers said, we must be careful because founding fathers didn't all agree. They didn't all say the same things. Alexander Hamilton was a founding father who I disagree with most of the time, not always, but most of the time. And we can show the evidence for that. If I were to give him an epitaph on his gravestone, and this really causes consternation to some of my participants in these classes. They've got all upset and send me nasty letters. They'll say, he's a great founding father. Why did you say that about him? Well, because all founding fathers aren't equal. And so here's my epitaph for Alexander Hamilton. father of constitutional subversion and the most famous nationalist in American history. Next Friday night, we'll have a detailed lesson on state sovereignty, the original concept, and he fits into that story. So people will say to me, oh, I heard this in a recent I was on the radio. It was a radio talk show, and a caller in said, 50 years ago, the federal government started violating the Constitution. Oh, really? 50 years ago. Well, last week it was 2 weeks ago, I spoke in Pleasant Grove at the Lincoln Academy, and one of the senatorial candidates gave a short speech, and he said, 70 years ago, the federal government started violating the Constitution. And, okay, afterwards I said, what did you have in mind? 70 years? Well, it was that case of, and he named the court case where the federal government started violating the Interstate Commerce Clause. I said, and you think that's the time they started violating the Constitution? I used to be a math teacher, and you know, if you take 1789 and subtract it from 2010, you will know when they started violating the Constitution. That's when, and he was the leader of it. Hamilton and Jefferson had different viewpoints, and so when we speak of our founding fathers, we must understand what viewpoint they're coming from. These two men did not agree with each other. They butted heads. What lesson am I in anyway? Am I still in natural law? How come these slides are in? I keep thinking this has got to come to an end. Bear with me, it will. The New York Sun in July 3rd, 1881, quoted President James Garfield as saying, "The influence of Jefferson's democratic principles is rapidly waning, while the principles of Hamilton are rapidly increasing. Power has been gravitating toward the central government." Now, this is a pretty good statement, except power wasn't gravitating, it was being yanked. The Globe Democrat of St. Louis, April the 9th, 1900. Lincoln, Grant, and the Union armies gave a victory to Hamiltonism when it subjugated the Confederates in the South. John Marshall, Chief Justice in 1801 to 1835, was a consolidationist and was the judicial exponent of Alexander Hamilton, carrying on the implied power concepts that Hamilton implemented with George Washington supporting them. It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Is that the duty of the judicial department? No, that's the duty of the legislature. Now, this is the beginning. I'm remembering now where this lesson takes us. It's very good. It'll take us right back to natural law. So what does this lead to? Well, it leads to what they call judicial review. It started with Alexander Hamilton and his implied powers doctrine. He convinced George Washington that they could have a national bank, not because it was authorized in the Constitution, but because it was such a good idea. It was just a great idea because of the implied powers. And this man carried that on in the Supreme Court. When it's in a bubble like that, that's me paraphrasing their belief. The citizens of the states were never sovereign, and therefore they must always yield to the supremacy of the federal government. This is an old doctrine that started coming out in the days of Alexander Hamilton. Next week's Friday night lesson will cover this in detail. The doctrine of judicial review led to the doctrine of judicial supremacy. Judicial supremacy. The judiciary insists what it says is the law. Makes no difference what the Congress had in mind. This is a government website you can go to today. Federal government website. They have a little Benjamin Franklin there. He gives you a choice up here as to which grade level you want to have questions and learning on. And then he says, the Supreme Court stands as the ultimate authority in constitutional interpretation. Its decisions can be changed only by another Supreme Court decision or by a constitutional amendment. Is this true? I don't see very many heads committing. I see a few. No, it's false. It's absolutely false. This is on the government website today. Propaganda. Beware of the flattery of prominent men. Beware of false educational ideas. This is one of them. It's very popular. It's so popular that it's in the Boy Scout Citizenship in the Nation Merit Badge Handbook. Oh, I'm getting in a touchy area here. This is like putting down George Washington. I mean, okay, I'm going to be brave. You haven't got your sandwiches to throw at me yet, see? A few months ago, I was invited to speak to the Boy Scout adult leaders about citizenship in the nation and the Merit Badge Handbook. They were kind enough to bring me the handbook the night before I was supposed to speak. I had, one evening to look and meditate. It didn't take very long. I read 2 sentences. The second sentence was false. Oh dear. What am I going to do tomorrow when I go to the adult leaders? And this was a stake event, and the stake presidency was there. Pretty sobering moment for me. How do I handle this? 18 errors. Either they were false or misleading because they didn't tell the truth, the whole story. I put what I call red flags in. 18 red flags in a book that only had 36 pages. That's one every other page. And the second sentence was the first one. So what do I do? Well, I went and stood bravely and I said, I'm supposed to tell you about this book in the second sentence. I want to read it to you. Is this true? And 2 of the people in the group out of 15 said, no, that's false. Only got 2 out of 15. The rest didn't know. They didn't know because they didn't do any homework. They haven't prepared their mind. They aren't mentally awake. Where'd they get that phrase? Boy Scout. Be mentally awake. You remember that one? No, you weren't a Boy Scout. Here's what it says on page 30. The Supreme Court has the final authority to interpret the meaning of the Constitution and determine if the law is being applied correctly and fairly. That's the same thing as Ben Franklin said. Supreme Court is the final say in what it means, and if they don't amend it, then it always means what they says it means. It's ridiculous false propaganda. They say it here, this is also false propaganda. I ask you this question, if that were true, what if the Supreme Court ceases to follow natural law and instead begins following the rule of lawmakers? And if they are the final say in what the Constitution means, is there no recourse? Is there no check and balance on the Supreme Court? Shouldn't there be one? There is. There is. And it's a really elementary one. It's in the Constitution. But first we've got to fill in the blank. You boys knew that when you were kids, didn't you? Mentally awake. You have to be mentally awake if you follow the Merit Badge Handbook. Okay, that's all. It's a great handbook, great program. I was a scouter for 6 years. Loved it, still good. Just be mentally awake. This is false propaganda, along with 17 other examples in that book. By the way, I've never spoken to such a quiet audience. There was not a single emotional demonstration of anything. They were all straight-mouthed, just listening. As I tried to explain the weaknesses, I couldn't find any strengths at that moment. I was having a hard time finding any strengths. I explained some of the inadequacies of the handbook. And finally, when it was over, one of them said, "What do you think we should do?" Be mentally awake. Open your mind. Learn the story of America. This is an example of the official literature. This extremely prestigious book, The Law in America, Blair Kaufman and Bonnie Collier, 2001, page 39. Today, the Supreme Court of the United States, the nation's highest judicial body, co-equal with the executive and legislative branches of government. Is this true? No, it's false propaganda. Totally nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And this is just typical of what's being propagated across the country. Now, this subject is still natural law. Remember, we have 2 contending forces, rule of law and rule of lawmakers. This is what the rule of lawmakers is promoting. I love this book. Phyllis Schlafly. In fact, I would safely say I love Phyllis Schlafly. What a great American woman. She's still alive, last I heard. In fact, she and I spoke together in Dallas, Texas 2 years ago. A great, great lady. And she's been in this cause for so long. Some of you know who I mean, don't you? Sure, great. She's in her 80s now. Just a wonderful woman. She wrote this book not very long ago. It's not too old, 4 or 5 years. The Supremacist. The Tyranny of Judges and How to Stop It. Chapter 15, How to Stop Judicial Supremacists. Now, this is good reading. I usually stock them on the table, but I keep running out. She takes our attention to the Constitution, the contract that we wrote between states. And in that contract, she takes us to the exceptions clause. This is the exceptions clause. The Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as Congress shall make. Now, is the Supreme Court co-equal with Congress? No, because Congress can tell them what cases they can hear on appeal. If they don't want the Supreme Court to talk about abortion or removing under God from the Pledge of Allegiance, they can take that away from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can't touch it. That's the exceptions clause. It's a great clause. I like this illustration of the hand. We'll use it 2 or 3 more times. The perfect hand. What a wonderful instrument. The United States of America, symbolized by the hand. The states, represented by the pointer finger, pointing the correct way. They sent delegates to a convention, those that wanted to. 12 of the 13 states sent delegates to a convention. They created a suggested plan of government which was eventually ratified by the states. It divided government in between legislative, executive, and judicial, and the judicial was down on the little pinky because it was the weakest of the 3 branches of government. In the Federalist Papers we read, the judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the 3 departments of power. And who do you suppose said that? Alexander Hamilton, the nationalist, admitted that the judiciary was the weakest of the 3 branches of power. He did a good job in the Federalist Papers, and we'll read more about that in another lesson. It's next Friday night. We'll find out why he said what he said. I'll give you evidence from his other speeches why he told the truth in the Federalist Papers. The fact of legislative supremacy, or in other words, the legislature has power over the executive and judicial branches. This is why. This is the evidence. Congress controls the purse strings. Can the president spend billions of dollars without Congress approving it? I love it. Yes. Is he supposed to spend billions of dollars without? No, he's not supposed to. Congress has the power to create federal courts, and hence the power to abolish them. All of the courts except the Supreme Court. Congress has the power to restrict appeals to the Supreme Court. Congress can impeach rogue justices. Can the justices impeach the congressman? No. So, is that statement in that law book true or false? It's absolutely false, even though it's propagated as truth all across the country. Now, what do you mean? Oh, yeah, they can impeach any of the Supreme Court justices. Yes, those justices, they should impeach them for not following the Constitution. The Supreme Court justices take an oath to uphold and defend this Constitution, not the figment of their imagination. So does the President. So does the Congress. The word is this, not the Constitution created in the minds of the living constitutionalist. You understand the difference? Okay, so the Congress should be impeaching any judge that doesn't follow the Constitution. It's that simple. Impeachment means they try him, found him guilty, remove him from office. And they select someone that will follow the document. It wouldn't take very many times until they catch on that they must follow it or not bother to apply for the job. The Pledge Protection Act of 2004 is an example of how this seldom used clause of the Constitution, the exceptions clause, can be applied. H.R. 2028 passed the House by 247 to 173. It never went to the Senate. I guess the message got through to lay off and leave under God in the pledge. No court created by act of Congress shall have jurisdiction, and the Supreme Court shall have no appellate jurisdiction to hear or decide cases pertaining to the Pledge of Allegiance. It's that simple. Congress gets 51%, and it's law. And they can't mess with it anymore. Now, here's one that, maybe I've got it on here. This is it. What Congress can do for this American. What is this American? That's an unborn baby. 1 million or so unborn babies are murdered every year in this country. Yeah, still going on since 1973. Something like 50 million total now. 150 a day, I believe, is the number they give me. Some bizarre number. What can Congress do for this American? What is our Congress doing? Nothing. Every year, the Sanctity of Life Act is put into the Congress by Congressman Ron Paul. And every year it's ignored. I called Ron Paul's office just a week ago to ask, what's the status of the Sanctity of Life Act? It never makes it out of committee. Why doesn't it make it out of committee? Because the majority of the committee do not want to stop abortion. That's why. Beware of three things: the flattery of prominent men, false educational ideas, and sexual impurity. A majority of the committee, I was told, would not get this act out of committee and let it go before Congress because they would prefer to have the nationwide abortion. Sexual impurity. In 1942, this grand old man stood in Salt Lake City. And he said, "You have heard all your lives that the day would come when the Constitution would hang by a thread. I do not know if it now hangs by a thread or by a small rope. But whether it lives or dies is now in the balance." That was in 1942. I was just 2 years old. In 2003, I hold this man in high respect. I've read two of his books. They were both excellent. You remember Robert Bork was nominated by President Ronald Reagan to become a justice of the Supreme Court. And when he went in his hearings, his problem was, and since then all of the nominees have been very careful how they dealt with it since this case, because he sat there and boldly explained, "If I am chosen as a judge of the Supreme Court, I will follow the Constitution according to its original intent." Oh, that was the wrong thing to say. His enemies raised $12 million to run a campaign to defeat his nomination. They successfully did so. Mr. Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, was, I think, the leader of that group. Judge Bork wrote the book about it, the story of that book, The Tempting of America, and then he followed up a couple of years later with Slouching Toward Gomorrah. Now that's descriptive enough. The book's about the trend we're taking in America today. In that book, he refers to the case of Lawrence versus Texas. Now it seemed the state of Texas passed a law that said sodomy is illegal in Texas. And they specified the crime and the punishment. Oh, okay. The Supreme Court took that case and overturned it. And they said, "You can't do that, it's unconstitutional." And at that point, Judge Bork wrote in his afterword in the 2003 edition, "The Constitution is simply gone." Now, if it was hanging by a thread or a small rope in 1942, Judge Bork figures it doesn't have any value in 2003. It's gone. If the judges can do that, what limitations are there? There are none. Isn't this terrible? That's the situation we're in. I use that phrase, we're in an awful situation. Well, that's the situation. Now, we don't provide razor blades. We don't want any slitting wrist here. It's not that bad. In other words, I'm just giving you the truth. Now we're going to try and find a solution to it also. In the event, these men were some of those judges over the period of years that declared, this is a quote from one of them, "We are under a constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is." This junk was obviously written by a bunch of right-wing kooks. The man on the right is William Brennan, the political caricature has drawn here. And they are throwing in the trash the U.S. Constitution. Well, we have government by judiciary today. From rule of law in the days of Sir William Blackstone to social Darwinism today. Casting aside justice, Diet versus Turner is an excellent case to read. Now, it's not beyond your ability. There's only perhaps a few. I don't know. Young lady, how old are you? Probably at age 10, you might not enjoy Diet versus Turner. But age 14 to 21 probably could consume it. Even maybe age 10 could. My 8-year-old came to one of my lectures recently, my 8-year-old grandson. He sat on the front row. He responded when I taught the audience. I'd ask some rhetorical question, and he would always come up with an answer. And when the lecture was over, at age 8, on the way home that night, and the next day, 2 or 3 times, he's still asking me, Grandpa, when are you going to have another lecture for 8-year-olds? So it worked. This is a good case. If you want to get a better grasp of what the awful situation is, it started a long time ago. And here we have a case of Diet versus Turner. Notice who did it. It's the Supreme Court of Utah. I don't know, writing all those words down, you can just Google Diet versus Turner, Utah, and probably get it. In any event, this case tells about the Supreme Court's abuse and how the United States government foisted upon us the 14th Amendment. You see, last week, the Supreme Court made a decision, and they based the decision on the 14th Amendment. In 1973, they made a decision, and they based the decision on the 14th Amendment. And over, they've made decisions, and they based them on the 14th Amendment. And here in 1968, we were taught the 14th Amendment's not even valid. And who taught us that? The Supreme Court of our own state. In that case, we read, the United States Supreme Court, as at present constituted, has departed from the Constitution, as it has been interpreted from its inception, and has followed the urgings of social reformers. Isn't that what this whole lesson's been about this morning? They have followed the urgings of social reformers, foisting upon this nation laws. No language could be stronger or more accurate than done in this Supreme Court case in the state of Utah. I say foisting. That's not a word that I use very often. What does it mean? They have imposed by fraud, is what our Supreme Court declared. The 14th Amendment. It goes on. As a result of the recent holdings of that court, the sovereignty of the states is practically abolished. Well, practically is not correct. It's totally abolished. And the erstwhile free and independent states are now in effect and purpose merely closely supervised units in the federal system. That's pretty good language, good explanation. In regard to the 14th Amendment, which the present Supreme Court of the United States has by decision chosen as the basis for invading the rights and prerogatives of once sovereign states, it is appropriate to look at the means and methods by which that amendment was foisted upon the nation in times of emotional stress. There that word is again. By fraud and force, we were given the 14th Amendment, and it's been used abusively ever since. In 1868, Sections 1 and 5 of the foisted 14th Amendment made the federal government superior to the states. This happened a long time ago. Betrayed by the Bench does a good job of helping us understand how our governments, how our high courts have betrayed us. Notice the subtitle, How Judge-Made Law Has Transformed America's Constitution, Courts, and Culture. And Steve, you said we have some back there. If they're in a box, put them on the table. That's good stuff. $4. If you don't have $4, just take a copy as a gift. Understanding where we once were and how we have gotten to where we are today can be used to bring America back to again being truly one nation under God. Now that's my hope as I try to explain where we once were and how we got to where we are today. Maybe then we can make wise choices and work toward becoming one nation under God. That's the end of this lesson.